Hello friends, and welcome back to Abridged by Alpal. This video deserves a little bit of backstory because at the very beginning of my channel, I said on some of my videos, as well as to some of my friends, I would never do a book review. However, here we are, and I'm doing a book review. The reason why is because one of my very, very best friends of all time, who has been so supportive of me and this channel, loves to watch book talk and booktube and book reviews, and she asked me if I would do one at the very beginning, and I told her no. And then a couple weeks ago, out of the blue, I said, okay, I'll do a book review just for you. You can pick the book. I just would prefer that it be a standalone. The book title that came out of her mouth, I was not expecting in a million years. And then she was like, oh, you don't really seem like you like it. And I was like, nope, I'm gonna do it because it's what you wanted me to read, and it's a standalone like I asked you to pick. And I always like to try new things. So the title that she picked for me is True Grit by Charles Portis, which was first published in 1968. Before I say anything further, I just need to make it very clear that I am a complete novice when it comes to the Wild West cowboy genre. I really have no idea what I'm talking about at all, so this is all based off of my own vibes and my experience reading completely different genres. So in no way, shape, or form do I think that this is an authoritative, definitive review on the book. This is just, thoughts coming from someone who prefers a different genre reading True Grit for the very first time. Usually when I do my reviews, I like to give books two different scores, one for enjoyment and one for craftsmanship, because I completely understand that sometimes I enjoy a book 100%, but it's not a very good book, objectively speaking. This one though, I'm actually going to give those two scores, as well as a third one, just for value to read, because this exists, I think, kind of in its own space, and I'll talk more about that when I get there. But first off, we'll start with enjoyment. My enjoyment on a scale of 1 to 5 for this one was a 2. Like I said, it just wasn't really my genre, and I felt like I spent the first 80% thinking that there wasn't really enough to keep me entertained. And then you hit like 80 to 85%, and suddenly we were in that sweet spot, and I was actually like, oh my gosh, like this is good, I'm enjoying this. And then from 85 to 95%, all of a sudden it got too intense, and it went past that line, and I felt kind of icky at some of the descriptions and the things that were going on. And then the last 5% of the book came all the way back to like, okay, we're rambling again. So I ended up only enjoying 5% of the book, which is kind of funny when you realize that it's only 200 pages long, and so I was only enjoying myself for about 10 pages. So my personal enjoyment of this book was a 2 out of 5. Craftsmanship for this book, I'm gonna give a 3, very middle of the road. Like I said before, the entire book felt kind of rambling and odd by way of prose, but I also had a little voice in the back of my head saying maybe that's on purpose. Like maybe the author did it this way to give it a more accurate feel to the time and place it took inspiration from. And I will say, it definitely made you feel like a 14-year-old was actually telling the story. However, it did not capture or keep my attention, and if I'm operating from the assumption that authors tell stories because they are important for people to read and to internalize and take into their lives, I think that even if it was accurate, it was not very effective in getting a reader to like invest and want to come back and finish the story. This was published 60 years ago, presumably is for people who enjoy Western books, which is definitely not me. And so I'm like double removed from ever really being the target audience for this book. However, I do feel like if it's a well-crafted book, even if it's someone who does not enjoy the genre and is not part of the era that it was written in, there should still be enough there to capture the attention of that sort of reader. My last score for this one is going to be value to read, and that one is a 4 out of 5, the highest one. Despite the fact that I didn't enjoy myself that much, I do feel like this is one of the pieces to read if you're trying to understand this time period of like the American frontier in the late 1800s. And so unless I read a better book, this will probably be my recommendation. I think that it gave a good picture. It wasn't hard to get through because it was very short. So even though I wasn't enraptured with it the entire time, I still think that the value for reading this one is a 4 out of 5. I think it's important to understand things that we don't come across in our daily lives. And even though probably no one, and by probably I mean definitely no one, is going to be coming across the late 1800s in frontier America, it definitely gives you some sort of insight I'm going to talk briefly about the plot. Like I said, it was rambling and sometimes pointless, and I found myself asking a lot, like, why was this section important to include? I would have this thought, and then I'd be like, well, I'll probably find out later in the book, or I'd be later in the book and I'd think about that scene from earlier and be like, has this tied in yet? And there weren't a lot of those little individual payoffs, but the plot as a whole definitely paid off at the end. I'd also love to talk about the characters. There were 3 main characters in this book. It was Le Beef, Rooster, and Natty. Le Beef, I did not like him at first, and I thought that he was going to be a hindrance. I thought that he was going to be one of those characters that was included just to make sure that there was regular opposition in the story. And I was upset that he came along with the 2 of them. But my opinion of him was definitely the opinion that changed the most as I read the book, to the point where at the end of the book, I was relieved when he showed up in a scene. Overall, I just felt like he was a very respectable character who showed up to do one job and really didn't deviate from the course and did what he wanted to do. Rooster, on the other hand, I felt like I liked the same amount, like very consistent throughout the entire book, but for completely different reasons, because he gave off this very grumpy grandpa vibe, even though he was not old. I know this. I kind of hated to love him and a little bit love to hate him at times. But he was, once again, like LaBeef, effective, and he got the job done, even though it was in a very, very different way. He was definitely kind of sticky at points in the book, but again, he was consistent and he was effective. Lastly, there's Maddie, my queen. She was such a baddie in all of this. She had this mentality of do no harm but take no shit, which is a mentality that I really respect. I felt like she responded to things in a logical way, if not logical, at least understandable. I felt like she lied when she needed to, and she pressed the envelope, and she was justified in her desires and her reasoning for things. Overall, I felt like she was a pretty unbelievable character, like 90% unbelievable, but not 100%, because I do think that maybe one girl existed like her, but when I was reading her character, I just felt like I could definitely tell that there was an adult man as the brains behind her character. So overall, my score of this book is a 3 out of 5. I didn't super enjoy myself, but I'm super glad that I read it, because I'm happy to try out other genres, and I don't want to feel like I've ever gotten stuck into a hole. And also, I love my friend, and I was very happy to read this book for her because she wanted to know my thoughts. It was short and it was not at all a pain to get through, so I would still recommend it to people. And I can definitely say I don't crave the Wild West aesthetic after, reading a book which I feel like is actually fundamental to the genre and not just this Bourne era too. A couple of bonus comments before I close out this video. I wanted to read a couple of the annotations that I made in the book. So, spoiler alert, at the very beginning of this book, her dad dies. And when she's coming to grips with this, she says that he's never going to come home and we're never going to see him again. And that felt obvious, but then she also said, nor would he ever again hearken to the meadowlarks of Yell County trilling a joyous anthem to spring. For some reason, that hit me harder than him never seeing his family again. There was an entire scene that was basically just reading the transcript from a court case. And that was, I think, the main scene where I finished it. And I was like, why did we need to know that? Was it just about setting scene? Was like one of these characters going to be really important later on? And it was kind of yes, kind of no. But I really found myself wondering after that, like, why was this significant? I also have a lot of comments in here about how much of a baller Maddie is. She just knew what she wanted and knew what she needed to do to get it. And I loved that. She's so serious and unserious at the same time. Oh, LaBeef, pronounced LaBeef, but it's LaBeouf, like Shia LaBeouf, and so I wrote down Shia Surprise. I also wrote down everything feels like exposition, and this was like 60% of the way through the book. Oh, yeah, they kept bringing up Jesse James and Northfield, Minnesota, which was funny for me as someone who grew up like 20 minutes away from Northfield. I know that it was infamous in its time for the incident that happened there. However, in my own mental framing, I'm like, Northfield? Why Northfield? Like, nothing's going on in Northfield. That's so funny. I was also surprised at the timeline of the book. I think I caught the very end of the John Wayne movie once when I was at my grandparents' house. And I definitely started this book thinking that it took place over the course of like a full year, because that's just kind of what it felt like. It felt like one of those grueling, long journeys, but it wasn't. It was actually just a couple of days, and they never got super far away from where the book started. I have one note that says last 15% and I'm finally enjoying it. And then the very next note is Bingles, all the Bingles, which my friends and I call bad tingles. And then the next note is gag. Very short-lived enjoyment there, but it was there. And my last comment that I want to make about this book is that I loved Little Blackie, who is the pony that she takes into the frontier. Maybe it's kind of like the dog trope for me, but Little Blackie was a highlight of the book. As always, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Please like it and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys next week. Bye. And Tara, I love you. This was for you.